One of the most annoying and potentially confusing elements of economics lies in a confusion between two concepts, inevitability and desirability. Economists believe that supply and demand are inevitable forces in the sense that they are powerful forces that must be taken into account. But economists don't believe the view that all outcomes of supply and demand are desirable. And economists certainly don't agree with the fatalistic conclusion that nothing can or should ever be done about the outcomes of supply and demand. Certainly, you can do things that will affect the prices and quantities produced in markets. A society might have goals that the market is not accomplishing. The question is, will the methods used by society or by government accomplish the desired goals, or may the result be less helpful or even counterproductive? This question of whether policy tools will accomplish the desired goals comes up with particular force when politicians and citizens think about trying to pass legislation to control prices. Disagreements about price and quantity in markets are inevitable, as we talked about before. Even if a price is at equilibrium, suppliers will always want to earn a higher price. Demanders will always want to earn a lower price. The suppliers will always talk about, how if they just had a little more money, they could create new jobs, they could build new factories, they could hire more people. The demanders will always talk about the difficulties of trying to get by at their income level. Now, these appeals may sound good, but they are, of course, almost nakedly self-interested. However, when we talk about them in public, you'll often hear discussions about how it's only fair that the price would be adjusted in some certain way. Businesses, for example, will talk about how if they could only get a fair price, by which they mean a higher price for their goods, if they could only get a fair price, they would create much more in terms of jobs and prosperity. Individuals will talk about how it's only fair that what they pay for their apartment rent or their electrical bill or a gallon of gasoline should be set lower than it is. Now, when those who demand a product are a politically powerful force, they can sometimes go to politicians and get those politicians to pass a law saying the price of certain goods should be kept low for their benefit. When the price of goods must be kept low, it leads to a price ceiling. The definition of a price ceiling is when the government sets a price above which more cannot be charged. An example of a price ceiling would be the rent control laws that limit how much rent can be charged on an apartment. The political argument, of course, is that society needs to have affordable housing and that the equilibrium price of rental apartments is too high. So the policy tool, the policy response is, let's pass a law to reduce the price. But this is where the forces of supply and demand kick in. The forces of supply and demand are unavoidable, and their existence means that price ceilings are going to have highly predictable consequences. If you set a price ceiling that is below the equilibrium level, and after all, the only reason you set a price ceiling is to keep the price below the equilibrium level, and the price cannot adjust upward to equilibrium because the price ceiling law says it cannot adjust upward, then the quantity demanded is going to be much higher. People who are buying whatever the good is are going to be enthusiastic about that low price. But suppliers of the good are not going to be so enthusiastic. So the quantity supplied is likely to be much lower. The result is a shortage. The quantity demanded is much higher than the quantity supplied. If you ever tried to find an apartment in a city with a strict rent control law, you can look around for a long, long time before you find a suitable apartment at a reasonable price. Why is that? Well, when price ceiling exists, market forces want to raise the price to equilibrium, but the higher price isn't allowed. So there's a shortage. Many buyers are willing to pay more than the regulated price. In practical terms, what happens in that situation? Well, rent control is a useful example because we have a lot of practical and historical examples of how it works. For example, New York City has had pretty strict rent control laws since about World War II. Many European cities have had rent control laws since World War II as well. And in the late 1990s, there were about 200 cities across the United States that had fairly strict rent control laws. Some of the better known ones were Berkeley in California, Santa Monica in California, and Cambridge, Massachusetts. Although it's interesting, in the last 5 or 10 years, a number of cities have backed off of their strict rent control laws, including Cambridge, Massachusetts. Well, what happens if there's strict rent control laws? Well, the consequences, of course, are predictable. When the quantity demanded is high and the quantity supplied is low, lines form. Lots of people want to get to whatever it is, and they can't because there just isn't that much of a quantity available. Owners of apartments can't raise the price, but they can do some other things. For example, they can let the apartments run down and do less maintenance than they otherwise would. They can't charge as much, but they can put less money into the property. They could also convert the apartments into condos, so then sell them rather than renting them, or they could just not build any more apartment buildings. It's also possible with various kinds of price ceilings that whatever supply there is going to get distributed through some form of political favoritism. There'll be certain apartments which are controlled in one way or another by employers or by government, and it's who you know, not your ability to pay the money, that determines whether or not you end up with the apartment. There's also the possibility for under-the-table payments of one kind or another. For example, with rent control, you begin to hear all these terms like, what about if you have a non-refundable deposit if you want to move into an apartment, or a key deposit for getting a key, or a cleaning deposit that you don't get back. All ways in which the person who owns the apartment is extracting extra money that people are willing to pay, but not actually calling it rent. Price ceilings also lead to situations of black markets or gray markets, where people are reselling the good to others who are willing to pay more. You hear about situations where someone has a rent-controlled apartment and they don't want to live there anymore, but they don't want to move out either because it's so cheap. So what do? They find someone else to rent the apartment from them, and they take the extra money illegally. That would be an example of a black market or a gray market. Also, renters stay in these cheap apartments for incredibly long times because they can't afford to give up their rent-controlled deal. That, of course, means nobody else can move in. Certainly not the newcomers who were the ones who apparently needed the affordable housing in the first place. And yet another way in which goods can be distributed when there is a price ceiling is that sometimes the government will distribute ration cards of one kind or another, or the government will designate who gets how much of what. At the end of the day, the basic lesson is the government can hold down the legal price. It can impose a price ceiling. But in a free society, you can't force sellers to produce more. And it is very, very, very hard to regulate all the possible ways of getting around a price ceiling, especially if you've got people who are willing to pay more and sellers who are willing to take more. One way or another, they can work some things out. Let's consider the opposite case, not a price ceiling, but a price floor. When those who supply a good are a politically powerful force, that group can sometimes get politicians to pass a law saying the price of certain goods should be kept high for their benefit. Remember, these are suppliers, so suppliers want to have a high price. And this would lead to a price floor. The definition of a price floor is when the government sets a minimum price and you're not allowed to charge less than that price. You're not allowed to pay less than that price. An example of a price floor would be the laws that guarantee farmers a certain price for their crops. Now, in the case of these laws, it's not literally a law that you can't charge less, but the way it works in the U.S. anyway is that there's a set of government payments for farmers that kick in if the price falls below a minimum predetermined level. And so a farmer would never sell below a certain price. They would sell the food to the government instead. The political argument, of course, for price floors and price floors in agriculture is that the nation needs a stable and an expanding supply of food. We need to keep farmers in business. They're a part of the U.S. heritage, and the equilibrium price is sometimes just too low. Notice the value judgment there, too low, through no fault of farmers. And so we need a law to guarantee that farmers get a fair price. And there's that value judgment in fair price again. These supports for farmers are especially aggressive and high across the European Union and Japan. In the early 2000s, the high-income countries of the world were spending an average of about $1 billion per day. And again, that's $1 billion per day supporting their farmers and keeping the prices of farm products high. Now, whatever the intentions that people express, whatever their intentions, their feelings about fairness, when they support price floors, the forces of supply and demand are just not avoidable. They mean that price floors are going to have highly predictable consequences. If you set a price that is above the equilibrium level, and it can't fall down to the equilibrium because of a price floor, then what's going to happen? Well, suppliers are going to be delighted at that high price, so the quantity supplied is going to be pretty large. Demanders, on the other hand, aren't going to be so enthusiastic about that high price, so the quantity demanded will be somewhat lower. The result is a surplus, the quantity supplied exceeding the quantity demanded. So, visual terms, mountains of surplus grain, oceans of surplus milk, although I guess it usually ends up as dried milk, so it's mountains of surplus milk as well. When a price floor exists, market forces want to reduce the price, but a lower price isn't possible. So that surplus arises, with many sellers willing to take the regulated price rather than selling to people who would actually demand it. In that situation, given that the forces of supply and demand are inevitable, what happens in the market? Well, the market can react in various ways, say in terms of agricultural markets. One thing that happens, for example, is when farmers are guaranteed a fairly high price for their crops, the price of farmland tends to go up. Because after all, the products that are produced on that land are worth more because of the price floor. What that means is that people who own farmland benefit, but there are lots and lots of farmers who rent their land. And those farmers don't actually benefit from the price floor. What they end up doing is, sure, they can get a higher price when they sell their crop, but they also pay higher rent when they're renting their farmland. And so part of the price floor is translated into a cost of farmland. There are also issues of what happens if you encourage people to produce more than is being demanded in the market. For example, there are issues of land and water use and environmental issues related to farming. For example, what happens if farming is extended out to marginal land, to scrub land, to land which probably shouldn't be intensively watered or intensively fertilized because the runoff might get into stream systems, the runoff might get into lakes and rivers. There's a variety of kinds of possible environmental damage that can happen from high-intensity farming. It's not at all clear that one wants to encourage high-intensity farming all the time. You need to think about what the impact on land would be instead. Now, of course, current law tries to think about that impact on land. It tries to have a set of rules about, expand production, but not in this way and not on this land and in these different ways. But those rules are very difficult to handle and easy to get around. Another possibility would be some sorts of quotas. In this case, the quotas wouldn't be how much do you get? The question would be how much can you sell? And there are a number of agricultural commodities in the U.S. where the government sets a quota on what producers are allowed to produce. And by setting that quota, they try and prevent people from producing too much. And a final approach, of course, is government programs that buy up and store the extra amount that is produced in one way or another. Then, of course, you have the problem of, well, how do you get rid of all the extra stuff that is produced? And one of the options that the U.S. has often used is, when possible, we send a lot of it off to low-income countries. We call it food aid. Now, food aid is, of course, when people are starving, potentially a really helpful, productive, positive thing. But it also can be extraordinarily destructive to farmers in low-income countries around the world. Farmers in low-income countries where people might be earning the equivalent of $500 a year or $1,000 a year have just no chance of competing against $1 billion a day in subsidies from high-income countries. One vivid example of this a few years back in the 1970s was there was a big earthquake in Managua, Nicaragua. The earthquake leveled large parts of Managua, and there was enormous human suffering, and there was a great need for new buildings, for medical supplies, for all sorts of disaster relief that would go straight to the big city. The U.S. said, well, this is a case where a lot of people need to be fed. And I think with good intentions, the U.S. government sent off an enormous amount of wheat to Nicaragua. But here's the thing about earthquakes. Earthquakes knock over buildings, but they don't knock over wheat fields. And so the farmers in Nicaragua all of a sudden had to compete with an enormous amount of free U.S. wheat, which suddenly appeared in the markets. We succeeded in feeding some people in the cities. We also succeeded in bankrupting an awful lot of the farmers who counted on that stuff. So when we think about how we're helping farmers in the U.S., we need to think about all of the costs and all of the consequences. One of the things that happens is that consumers in rich countries pay more for their food. And you can argue, well, you know, it is a rich country, the United States, and if we want to have consumers pay more, if we want to spend some tax money on farmers, you know, so be it. There's a lot of things in the economy that we spend money on just because we think they're a good idea. But to me, the toughest argument about farm policy is that some of the poorest people in the world, some of the poorest people in the world who live by agriculture alone, end up having much less because of agricultural subsidies. The point of it is that if the taxpayers and consumers are willing to pay the bill, a rich country can certainly afford to give higher prices to producers. But you can't force people to buy the extra that's produced. And it's very, very hard to control all of the other ways that markets can adjust to having some big surplus of production. Price floors and price ceilings are each intended to help specific groups. In most markets, some demanders or some suppliers are always in dire need of economic help, and others don't need as much help or perhaps any help. For example, in the case of affordable housing, some people need it, but a lot of people may not need any direct help. However, price regulation draws no distinction between who's needy and who's not. Price regulation, price floor, price ceiling changes the price for everyone. Some people will need the help they receive, but lots of other people won't need it. Others will bear the costs even though they don't especially deserve to pay those costs. When we think about that problem, you sort of think about farmers. Well, in some areas are going to be individual small farmers, and they might really need financial help in order to make it through. But an awful lot of farm production is really large corporate farms. They're making a lot of money, and the price floor is just a benefit to an enormous agribusiness company. Again, the price floor draws no distinction between who's needy and who is not. It changes the price for everyone. So when you think about whether or not you want to help people or not help people through price floors and price ceilings, what you need to do is think about, are the benefits going to the people who they really want it to go to? What if the government tried instead to help everyone? What about if we had price floors for all the producers to make sure they had high prices, and we had price ceilings for all the consumers to make sure that everything was affordable? So bingo, we've got high prices for all the producers, we've got low prices for all the consumers, and the problem is, how does this work exactly? How can you have a situation where the consumers aren't paying very much and the producers are getting a lot? Well, what we're actually describing in that scenario is really actually the old Soviet Union, where back in the 1980s, something like a quarter of the central government's budget was subsidies, because the government was simultaneously trying to subsidize high prices for the producers and low prices for the consumers. Now, the problem at the end of the day, of course, is you can't subsidize everyone for everything all the time. Somewhere, the money has to come from somewhere. Not only do you have budgetary costs, but you have the prices of shortages and surpluses and black markets and all the rest. One of the most memorable comments about that was from Nikita Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union some decades ago. And Khrushchev was once quoted as saying, "Economics is not a subject that greatly respects one's wishes." It's not enough just to say, boy, I sure wish all the producers could have high prices. I sure wish everyone could pay low prices. Economics doesn't respect your wishes in that way. The market is just too powerful to ignore. Governments can alter prices, but as long as individuals and businesses have some freedom to act in a self-interested way, they're going to react to those new price incentives. They're going to supply more or demand less in ways that are really thoroughly predictable. Remember, what lies behind a willingness to supply? Really, it's the firm thinking, can we make a reasonable level of profit? If the society is relatively free and a firm doesn't think they can make a reasonable level of profit, you can't make them produce. Even in a society which is not much of a free market, you can force firms to produce, but you can't guarantee they'll produce at much quality. They may well produce at a very low quality. Even in a government-owned or government-controlled firm, you can't have costs that are greater than revenues forever unless the government is willing to subsidize forever. And somebody has to pay for those subsidies in the rest of the society. On the other side of the market, the demand side, remember that what lies behind demand is whether, compared with all the other goods that are available, people want to buy something. In a free market, you can't force people to buy and use something. Almost always, substitutes and other options are available. These are extremely powerful forces, these forces of demand and supply. Governments can pass laws about prices, but as long as individuals and businesses can act in a self-interested way, they are going to react to those new price incentives by supplying or demanding more or less in perfectly predictable ways. Now, about here is where people often get very grumpy with economists and accuse them of having a concealed agenda. The comment that you hear is something like, okay, you might say that you're not dictating policy. You might say you're open to different kinds of policies, but it sure sounds like you're dictating policy. You obviously don't care about helping poor people with affordable housing. You obviously don't care about farmers. You might say this is a whole riff about price floors and price ceilings and equilibrium and da-da-da-da, but really, it's just an excuse for fatalism and inaction. And the response from economists is, criticizing one set of policies doesn't mean that no policies are acceptable. Let's consider some alternative policies that don't involve price floors and price ceilings. Instead of trying to assure affordable housing with rent control or price regulation, consider some other possibilities. For example, one could, on the demand side of the housing market, give money to the poor, raise welfare payments in one way or another. Or if you're worried about welfare payments just being cash that might be wasted or that might not be spent on housing, you could give the poor housing vouchers, which could only be spent on housing in one way or another. So you could help the poor buy housing in a targeted way that doesn't affect the price in the market in a direct way by providing them with demand-side help. Alternatively, on the supply side, in order to provide affordable housing, you might subsidize the building of low-cost housing. Or you could require small apartments to be built through certain kinds of zoning ordinances. Perhaps most of all, a lot of economists have done studies in the last few years suggesting that a real problem is that zoning laws prevent building lower-cost housing. Zoning laws that require fairly big houses, fairly big apartments, fairly big condos. And if you got rid of those rules, or at least limited how much they can limit what people can do, much more low-cost housing would be built. So, either increasing the demand for housing from poor people or increasing the supply of housing by removing these restrictions should both result in a higher equilibrium quantity of affordable housing. And any of these policies will avoid the problem of shortages and surpluses. Imagine that the policy goal is to assure a decent standard of living for farmers with small and medium-sized operations. Now, again, there are a variety of ways to do this that don't involve price floors. For example, let's think about on the demand side. We could subsidize buyers of food through food stamps or school lunch programs or giving buyers of food certain kinds of money. And that will encourage the demand side and that should help farmers in terms of being able to sell more of their product. On the supply side, you could reason as follows. If the goal is to give farmers income, well, give them income. But separate the income from what is produced. This is sometimes called delinking in the agricultural policy, agricultural economics literature. The idea is separate the idea of helping the income of farmers and separate that so it's not connected to how much the farmers produce. Now, economists have been arguing for delinking those two for half a century or so. Actually, some of it has been happening in the last decade, partly in the European Union, partly in the US. My point is that either of these choices are better for farmers than price floors. And they avoid this problem of creating lots of surpluses, of having bad effects on farmers in third world countries, of changing the prices of farmland, and all the other sort of undesired outcomes. Really, the choice of price floors and price ceilings, when those are your policy tools, the real problem is that the political system has some bad incentives within it. And the political system tends to choose those tools precisely because they're not especially good tools. Let me try and explain what I mean by that. Economists like to have the trade-offs be clear and acknowledge the trade-offs. You want to subsidize something? Fine. Pay for it, and let's compare the costs and the benefits. Politicians, on the other hand, often prefer to hide the costs if at all possible. Price floors or price ceilings look like a zero cost to politician. It doesn't require any money to be spent. It doesn't require a budgetary rule. It doesn't require tax to be cut or a policy to be changed. That's precisely why economists like tax and subsidy policies, because it makes the costs and benefits much more apparent and much more clear than does a policy of price floors or price ceilings. Economists also like to be clear about what is the goal. What's the goal of this policy? Who's helped? Who's paying? What are the costs and benefits? Politicians often prefer to be fuzzy about who's paying because they don't want to make any enemies by saying you're paying the costs of this policy. Politicians also like a program which at least claims to help everybody. So let's imagine there are some people who need affordable housing. And we could draw the line wherever you want. You could say the 13% of the people below the poverty line need help with housing, or the bottom 20%, or whatever goal you want to set. But whatever goal you want to set, rent control for 100% of the population is not the answer. Economists would say focus in on the group that you really want to help. Don't just randomly try and give benefits to everyone.